When it comes to assessing previous projects, companies can be very good at discussing some of their successes, but perhaps not so good at discussing some of their failures. Whilst it can be understandable that failure is somewhat of a taboo subject, it can be problematic for future teams who often repeat some of the mistakes of their predecessors. Today on Lokad TV, we're going to understand how many companies can actually make mistakes, but only the best learn from them using something called negative knowledge. So Janice, this is something we've touched on before on Lokad TV, but what do we mean by negative knowledge?
Negative knowledge is about to know what doesn't work. And it's kind of puzzling because you see there are some, I would say some elements of knowledge, let's say for example fundamental science, where we have incredible success of positive knowledge. You know, for example, we have uncovered laws of physics, and some incredibly brilliant mind predicted almost a century ago that black holes should exist, and lo and behold, literally like a century afterward almost, we finally managed to kind of have the first direct observation of a black hole. But that's positive knowledge, and it works, I would say, for fundamental sciences, physics, and when it works, it's incredibly powerful. But the reality is that, for example, in soft domains, soft science like sociology, business, and this sort of things, it's typically the negative knowledge that works best. It's something where you can never be sure that something is completely true. You can never be sure that something absolutely works, but you can be fairly confident that something actually is deeply wrong or do not work. So that's this negative part, is that the opposite. When you look at the opposite of something being true, you don't know for sure, you just know that something else is very incorrect or very wrong or very dysfunctional.
So let's look at some of those sort of soft domains, as you so called them then. Why is it so interesting to them? So why are those businesses so interested in negative knowledge?
I mean, businesses are not that interested in negative knowledge. That's the main problem, is that it's very uncool and it's not fashionable at all, you see. And my own take is that negative knowledge is gradually more important as you move to fuzzy, complex topics. Quantum mechanics is not actually complex; it's super complicated. There is not that many physical laws that govern what we call quantum physics, but they are like incredibly complicated. On the other hand, a supply chain is kind of the opposite. There is nothing that is fundamentally super complicated at anything. You have crates, trucks, pallets, machine that produce things. So all of the, I would say, elementary parts are quite simple, but you have a lot of them, and you have combination of people, software, machines, a whole network of stuff, and all of that complete, generates a lot of opacity. And that's why it's very hard to approach this kind of super complex domain with positive knowledge, because you can't frame your supply chain, frame it into like a few axioms, a tiny few elements that would explain everything. It's like irreducibly complex, and thus there is almost nothing where you could say this is it, this is a recipe, and it will work. Because when you confront this kind of simplistic ideas to the real world, it tends to be, to fail by the fact that you have many edge cases that do not fit this simplistic perspective.
Okay, so you talk about sort of capturing this negative knowledge. What are the sort of ways in which we can capture this knowledge?
So the thing is, first is to acknowledge that failures are like omnipresent, in supply chain, and it's most vendors claim that they have only stream of successes, but literally a Lokad, the most puzzling thing is when I started Lokad, that was about 10 years ago, even at the time, supply chain optimization wasn't at all a new thing. It was already ancient. It was, ancient by software standards. So it's like, let's say 4 decades old, which is as old as it can get, as far enterprise software is concerned. And thus, there has been already, even before I started, there had been already like generations of failure And what is very interesting that during the 10 years I've been running Lokad, I just discovered all those kind of untold failure that happened, before us. And when we had successes, it took really a lot of effort to realize that we were actually succeeding, but there were like 6 previous attempts, mostly undocumented, like silently buried, that did happen before us. And it's very difficult it was very difficult to even gain knowledge about those. And the situation when we did fail, and it did happens, frequently what was even more maddening is that when you were failing and at the end of the project, when you kind of debrief, you finally manage to get some nuggets of information. It appears that the 2 previous iterations failed for the same reasons that were like left completely undisclosed. And again, I believe that for companies, which are like large bunch of people, it's very hard to put forward your previous failures, because who gets the blame. Imagine you're like the executives that carried forward a large initiative that turned out to be like wasting tens of millions of euros or tens of millions of dollars in your company. It's not exactly the sort of things that you want to put forward on your resume. And despite the idea of let's be tough and on subjects and soft on people, literally in the end it's only people that gets the blame. You're not going to blame the mathematical formula even if it was incorrect. In the end, you blame whoever came up with this formula and yielded it, and in the end did something wrong, which costed a lot of money or just failed to deliver what was expected from that.
How can you possibly change this culture? Because at the end of the day, we're all human. We don't want our names associated with things that have gone badly. So how can you actually change that culture?
So there are many ways. First is the idea there are ways to not make the problem worse. So for example, there are like super toxic mottos such as get it right the first time. That's the recipe to have like endless streams of problems. So that get it right the first time is like, again, supply chain is very complex. So it means that if you want to achieve success, you need to iterate over something that is like failing, and then you iterate, rinse and repeat, and maybe through super fast iteration for a year, you will get success. But it's very iterative, and that means that you're going to keep failing until it works. So the idea of doing like, let's do it right the first time, that is like completely poisonous, because it forces people to, I would say, to make all their failures, as discreet as possible, to make them not visible, to don't communicate on any failure that happens. The opposite of that is, for example, fail fast. Fail fast, which is like Silicon Valley, spirit of move fast and break things. It does encourage people to take risks, and I think that's the first step. What makes it very complicated in supply chain is that typically the cost of failure can be very high. You need to find ways to fail fast without endangering your company and without generating massive risk for your company in the process.
So it's quite a funny concept, isn't it, really, that you want to fail and actually fail quickly? So
Yes.
what are the ways in which you can sort of speed that process up?
So first, you want to put in a position where it's possible to fail. So there are many ways that you get in a position where it's not possible to fail. One example is that if you sign a very large deal with a very large big name, let's say IBM, SAP, Oracle, and you take a 3 years commitment, then how can you actually fail fast? It's not possible. You're kind of completely, attached to your solution provider for a multi-year contract. And I think the worst situation I've seen was in aerospace, where they were like 10 years deals being signed. For me, that's literally insane. It means that people around the table acknowledge that there is no potential failure that can happen any faster than an horizon, a multi-year horizon. So you need first to think of how much time will it take to shut down the initiative if we see that it doesn't pan out. And then as you move forward, the question is, people, for example, frequently ask all the wrong questions, such as, prove me that you have ROI which basically gives a huge incentive to the vendor to just come up with blatant lies. If you press a vendor, say me, but give me, case studies on the ROI that you've generated. I mean, any large vendor will come up with fantastically high numbers. Why? Because let's say you're SAP, you have thousands of clients. So when you deploy SAP, some of those clients will have as a starting point a very, very bad starting point, because the company was dramatically mismanaged so far. So you deploy SAP at the same time that the company gets a new management. The new management is so much more better than the previous one, and SAP is better indeed than maybe what was before. The combination of the two, you end up with fantastic results. Also, you might have also things such as there was like an economic cycle that really helped. For example, last year, it was, or 2 years ago, it was the whole fintech world was crazy about blockchain. Nowadays, not so much. So you see, maybe you can end up with like the markets getting incredibly enthusiastic about something, and the next year not so much. But if you cherry pick your numbers, it will look like if SAP got a deployment in a blockchain company 2 years ago, they would say, oh, we had like 1,000% of growth over the year, which was all done thanks to the new ERP. But maybe not. It was maybe like something else was at play. So what I'm saying is that so you focus on all the wrong thing instead of saying how can you have you can identify what is failing super fast so that you change, and you try to to have like a capitalistic way of moving forward. But that means that you need to acknowledge whenever you're doing something that seems to be not capitalistic, to stop doing it fast. Like when I say fast, I mean as soon as you've identified that, literally the very minute you've identified that something is like not properly capitalistic, you don't accrue value for the company doing that, stop doing it. And that goes completely against, for example, having this waterfall planning where you have your all like 6 months roadmap rolled out. It means that, again, that's the opposite of failing fast.
Okay. Let's sort of move away from sort of the failing side of things and sort of that very negative side of things,
yes,
and move a bit more towards kind of the positive side of things. I mean, big companies, even sort of the Amazons and the Googles of this world, have had projects that fails. How can companies kind of learn from those failures? What are the things they should be doing to learn from them?
I mean, the first thing is that nowadays many failures are not actually that secret. It's not a secret that Lidl, wasted something like half a billion euro on a failed SAP setup, in Germany. There is something to learn from, and maybe any single clients who want to do a similar large-scale project should probably start by spending more than a few hours to do whatever they can to learn from this failure, to say what went exactly wrong, and those are the spectacular ones. But there are many, other situations. I know that, for example, Accenture is now getting to court facing Hertz, one of their clients in the US, because they had they disagree on the delivery of their new website. Obviously, it's hard. I would not, pinpoint the blame on saying Accenture got it all wrong. It's probably much more complicated than that. But probably no matter who is to blame for, it failed. This whole initiative failed, and they are talking about something like $30 million wasted on your new web platform. So it is pretty. It's a fairly expensive mistake, and so those sort. I mean, there is plenty of failures that are maybe not like widely accessible, but that are accessible. And if you want to spend a bit of time to study them, there is plenty of materials that are available, directly on the web. The thing is that it takes a certain mindset to even be looking for that, because you see, people are super happy to watch TED Talks who will give you an incredibly enthusiastic view of the future. It takes another type of mindset to say, okay, I'm going to dig up, the mud and the dirt to see all the things that are like what went wrong. And usually the root cause are, the human flaws. People are lazy, people are not curious enough, people are not, are sometimes dumb. Yeah, I mean, when I say people, I mean me as well. There is those part of those defects are in any of us. So it takes a certain mindset to, spend a sizable portion of your time to dig up, online or through your network, those sort of nuggets, and to put that in your head and to cultivate this knowledge about all the things that went wrong, to say all those things are, more risky than it seems. And maybe if you can see a pattern that something that looks like a good idea, but a lot of people tried and it failed every single time, well, maybe it's not such a good idea after all. And maybe if you don't exactly understand why it did fail, if you can see the pattern that whenever it was done that way, it did fail, then maybe you should, stay clear from this path.
Okay, sounds like it takes a very kind of pessimistic mindset. The problem with the supply chain industry is all of these mistakes, like you sort of mentioned, is costing huge amounts of money, and so they're kind of hidden under the carpet a little bit. Are there any industries that are doing this much better and taking advantage of this negative knowledge in a much better way?
It's still fairly new. I mean, for example, the Journal of Negative Results in Biomedicine was launched in 2002, and at the time it triggered a massive controversy because you see that was like researchers that were publishing negative work, which is I believe extremely needed. But by doing that, they were literally demolishing the work of their colleagues, because imagine you publish a negative result, and this negative result actually goes against maybe 10 other papers from your colleagues that were supposedly proving that something was promising, and then you prove that it's not promising, it doesn't work. And it literally this journal actually stopped 2 years ago. So they stopped publishing, which is a bit sad. But it proved that even in hard science, it's the communities have, I would say, difficulty to come to terms with this idea of negative knowledge. Although it is, I believe, absolutely fundamental to survival in the broader sense. I mean, for your company, survival means not doing something so stupid that you go bankrupt. So it is the sort of knowledge that is very difficult to accept. I think one of the company who is actually quite good at that is, again, Amazon. And I believe a key factor to that is their culture of having written memos, not PowerPoints, but memos. Because my belief is that it's when you PowerPoints, when you just put bullets and whatnot, you don't necessarily convey the logic and the connectors between your bullet points, and thus a lot of the message can be left untold, unsaid, and so that gives you a lot of leeway to be very fuzzy about what went wrong, who were to blame and whatnot. If you say that the only thing that you're allowed is just prose, just plain text, and you need full sentences, it's much harder to disguise the essence of the problem. And if you or actually you can much more easily identify that a piece of text is super evasive.
Is one of the problems here, because there's so much documentation already out there, if people started producing all the documentation of what went wrong and what didn't work, would you not end up in a scenario where there's just too many things out there to possibly read?
I disagree with the fact that there is too many documentation. That's the thing that is maddening, is that, for example, supply chain, I mean, most of our clients, even the clients that operates very large supply chains, I mean, when I say very large, I mean, over $1 billion worth of stock or 1 billion euros worth of stock, so fairly large, is that frequently the whole thing relies completely on oral traditions. Nothing is written ever. And the only things that get written are like hundreds of slides of PowerPoints where you have thousands of bullet points that are all disconnected. So it's like you have to read between the lines, between the bullet points, to even start to make sense of what what did work well and what didn't. No, that's the crux of the problem, is that there is very, very little that is documented. And again, I believe that is also related to the fact that failures are actually omnipresent. So most things fail. Executive, management do not want to leave extensive tracks of all their failures, even if those failures were actually the reason why they managed to succeed in the end. Because you see, it doesn't matter. For example, Edison said that he had learned 1,000 ways to not produce a light bulb before figuring out how to produce a light bulb. So it doesn't matter that you've been failing 1,000 times. What matters is that your failures were not like terminal failures, that you did not bankrupt your own company failing that way, that you every time you learn something and that you can succeed in the end. But that means that what about documenting all those failures? And again, my own experience in the supply chain industry is that there is very, very little documentation. And the few documentation there is like documentation written for machines, not humans, like IT documentation, which can be thousands of pages long, but that are completely worthless. They are certainly not worth the time you would take to read them.
Okay, so let's start sort of bringing this sort of together now. So it's basically the key message is that from a leadership perspective, our leaders should be celebrating the times when their teams fail and accepting that these things kind of happen because humans are kind of fundamentally flawed and it's to be expected.
I would say more than celebrating, it's about, say, you want to be a bit like a scientist and document your stuff. It's absolutely. I have an absolutely terrible anecdote that comes to my mind. It was during the early days of the Manhattan Project, I believe, where they had what it's called a criticality incident. So they were playing with nuclear materials, uranium, and in a lab they brought 2 pieces of uranium too close, so they got what it's called a criticality incident. It's like a tiny nuclear explosion. It's just a burst of radiation, and basically the researchers that faced the burst told everyone, please freeze, don't move, and he took a piece of chalk and took notes on the ground on exactly the position where everybody in the room was standing. And he did that, and by doing that, a couple of weeks later, everybody died of radiation poisoning. But the interesting thing was, thanks to this researcher who had the insight of, say, everybody freeze, took the time, they knew that they were all going to die, and he took the time to take notes of on the ground on exactly where they stand. They were able to prove that basically every meters count, and that if you were like 1 meter further away from the radiation burst, you would actually die 2 days later. So, and they had like first empirical confirmation like radiation poisoning is deadly, and that the intensity is completely correlated to the speed in which you were going to die. But you see, it takes like relatively a still mindset when facing, something that is like catastrophically bad, or is that you perceive as catastrophically bad. Here, that's probably the far end of the spectrum where like you're facing like literally mortal danger. But people in companies, even if nobody is going to die, they can still be under a tremendous amount of stress, and it's very especially when things are falling apart and you're not succeeding. Even if the company is not in danger, you as a person can still be under a tremendous amount of stress. And it's very hard to think straight and to do this kind of effort, of stilling your mind and say, well, we are still going to take notes. It's depressing, but we are still going to write it down so that the people that comes after us, might benefit from this knowledge. So it is, a certain effort. It's not just celebrating, the failure. It's about, acting in a way that this failure can be capitalistic. And that you see, it's not about being happy or enthusiastic about it. It's more about, okay, we are facing a catastrophic situation. How do we make sure that our future selves, people that come after us, will not repeat that? And it takes again a very specific sort of efforts to achieve that.
Okay, nice cheerful anecdote to finish us on there.
Yes.
Okay, that's everything for this week. Thanks very much for tuning in. We'll be back next week with hopefully a more cheerful episode. But until then, thanks for watching.